Ryan, and I am, and tonight's talk is about walking the Camino de Santiago. Some of you may have attended a couple of other talks I gave here, one on the book Exploring Galena and Dubuque on Foot, and the other one on the Appalachian Trail. So, but in addition to those walks, I've also walked the Camino de Santiago twice. I did one route, the Camino Francis in Spain, and then I did the route from Le Puy in France to Saint Jean Pied de Port. And I'm going to make a quick little mention, but the book I wrote, Exploring Galena and Dubuque on Foot, there's now a brand new bookstore in Galena that is selling the book, along with the Galena Gazette and the History Museum. So, and that bookstore is Galena Book and Paper, and that's on, well, let me get you the exact address. It is at 306 South Main, and the book is also at Riverlight and in Dubuque and at the Mississippi River Museum. So with that, we'll get back to our talk. So that was our brief little interruption. And so briefly, what the Camino de Santiago is, it's a series of pilgrimage routes that originate in almost every corner of Europe and then eventually converges upon the city of Santiago de Compostela in the far northwest of Spain. And the reason for the pilgrimage routes converging on Santiago is that at the Cathedral of Santiago, the bones of St. James the Apostle are supposed to be buried there. And St. James in Spanish happens to be Santiago. So that's the reason, for this whole pilgrimage to get started. And people have been walking to Santiago for over 1,000 years. And in recent years, it's become very, very popular because there's many best-selling books, especially in Europe, and movies. I'm sure many of you probably saw the movie The Way with Martin Sheen, and all of that has made the Camino extremely popular in recent years. There's also several Camino routes going across France, that converge upon the town of Saint Jean Pied de Port. I happen to have the route I did in France. Let me just back up there. The route I did in France, somehow we jumped a couple slides. The route I did in France went from Le Puy to Saint Jean. Now, the Camino that you saw in the movie The Way, or read in books or seen in magazine articles, is Camino Francis, and that goes from Saint Jean Pied de Port, and the term Pied de Port means foot of the pass. So it is on the French side of the Pyrenees, and it goes from Saint John, where you climb over the Pyrenees. You go through Pamplona, which is made famous by Ernest Hemingway in The Running of the Bulls. You go through the city of Burgos, Leon, and then 500 miles later, you finally get to Santiago. And it's a Camino Francis is that when most people think of the Camino, that's the route they think of, because that's what you've read about and that's what you've seen in the movie. And so that's what we'll be talking about tonight. It would be great to talk about the Camino in France, but we just don't have enough time. And so, but some of the things I'd like to mention is, for me, walking the Camino was just an amazing experience. It's one of the most wonderful things that I've ever done. And I'm sure most people who walk the Camino want to do it again, whether they do the Camino Francis or they do a different route. It's just getting out there. It was just such an incredible experience. There are several ways that you can do the Camino. You can do a long walk, such as what I did, going from St. John to Santiago, which is a 500-mile walk. That's going to take you anywhere from a month to 6 weeks, depending upon your walking speed. But there's other people who will break that walk up into several smaller walks, and then we'll eventually get to Santiago. And probably the third option that you have available is that many people will start in a town called Sarria and then walk the final 100 kilometers into Santiago. And the reason for that is to qualify for Compostela, which is a certificate of completion. You need to walk at least the last 100 kilometers, or it's a little over 60 miles, to do that. And then as for how to do the walk, there's the traditional way of the pilgrim, which is staying at albergues. And albergues are shared accommodations. They're essentially bunkhouses. You can get a hot shower there. There's a place to rinse out your socks. And usually there will be a pilgrim meal on site or an adjacent restaurant where you can then have a communal meal with other pilgrims. Certainly more expensive accommodations are available for those who want to have their own room and eat at restaurants. And also, there's things, if you want to spend the money, you can have somebody luggage hauling services so you don't have to carry a backpack. But most of the people that I was familiar with who were doing the walk from St. John to Santiago went the traditional way of the pilgrim, carrying a backpack and just staying at albergues. And the other thing I want to mention is that the Camino is for everybody. It is obviously Catholic in origin, but you don't have to be a Catholic to do it. You don't even have to be religious to do it. In fact, you'll find it to be a very international experience. I met people from over 35 different countries when I walked from St. John to Santiago. Most of them were from Europe, and today's Europe is very, very secular. So there isn't a requirement, to be religious, to go to church every night or anything like that. But one thing that you will find, when you spend a month outside walking in fresh air, surrounded by gorgeous scenery, immersed in a positive and welcoming environment, there's no way that, some spiritual aspect will become part of your Camino experience. So today what I want to do is I want to show you what it's like to do a Camino and what's along the way, and then get into some, a little bit of specifics on how to do it. And at the same time, open it up to any questions that you may have. And I do want to mention that if your question doesn't get answered, if we run out of time, you're always welcome to email me, and I'll be happy to, I'll make every attempt I can to answer your question. And I would, as I mentioned, I'd love to talk about France, but we just don't have the time. So we'll get started on the Camino. And the jumping off place is Saint Jean Pied de Port. We're right on the Camino route. And when you get to Saint Jean, it's like being dropped back, maybe 800 years ago, 900 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And, all of a sudden you're in this middle town from the Middle Ages, and you expect to see knights in armor, coming back from the wars, and people throwing flowers. And it's just such an incredible town. And the town itself it's a fortified town, so it's got fortifications surrounding the town. And this is where your jump off spot is. And this is where, if you saw the movie The Way, this is where Martin Sheen came to pick up his son's ashes and started doing the Camino. And what you'll find is that your first day in the Camino will be the hardest walking day that you have, because most people will go from St. John to Roncesvalles, which is at the top of the Pyrenees, and that's about a 16-mile walk, and there's maybe about maybe 4,000 feet of elevation gain during that day. So that's the hardest walking day that you have on the Camino. And because it's a long day and you've traveled to get to St. John, you may still have some jet lag. You're going to want to get an early start on that first day. And so in my case, I started about 6:30 and it was still dark at that time. I went in early April, but the cool thing is starting the walk over a Roman bridge. And it is so cool to walk over a bridge that was built 2,000 years ago. And that is part of your Camino experience, is that you're in all these things that were built so long ago, and you're walking by them every day. But soon after the sun comes out, and you're just going through this gorgeous countryside, and in some places, the Camino might be on a country lane such as this. And in other places, it starts getting its own right of way that happens to be paved in flagstone. And because we're going through the Pyrenees, it actually becomes a hiking trail, much like you would find, on the Appalachian Trail. But after, you just keep at it, and you do get to the top of the Pyrenees, and you get to the town of Roncesvalles. And that's Roncesvalles there in front of us. And this big building in front of us that looks like an abbey, that's actually an albergue. There's very few albergues that have anywhere near this size along the route. But this being a jump-off point, and what I need to say is albergues are the shared accommodations that are available to you as you go along. In fact, when you're walking, you're saying, geez, I didn't think there'd be enough people to fill this up. But a lot of people skip the walk, from St. John. And so they'll start their Camino from Roncesvalles, and certainly anybody in Spain who's doing the whole route, they'll start in Roncesvalles. But the albergues come in all shapes and sizes. But this is the inside of the albergue in Roncesvalles, and you can see it's just a series of bunk beds, and it's relatively new. But in another town, El Ganzo, which is further west, it's a mountain community. It's almost there's only a couple dozen people that live there, but here's this old building that's been renovated into an albergue, and there's a sleeping loft up at the top. So you have this type of accommodation. And then another one, in this case, there were several rooms that just had bunk beds in it. So maybe about 30, 35 people. There's probably accommodations for 30 or 35 people there. So these albergues just come in all shapes and sizes. But the one thing that every albergue has in common is that when you get to the albergue, the first thing you do is you take off your boots and put them up on the boot rack. And so that means in your backpack, you got to have a pair of camp shoes. I happen to have very lightweight Crocs, and they work just fine for me. So, but in reading the guidebooks, I had no idea that you couldn't walk around with your boots on. But that's true of every albergue. You leave your boots on the boot rack, and so you just wear some kind of camp shoes, flip-flops, Crocs, whatever's lightweight and comfortable for you. And then the next thing you'll do after you take off your boots is you're going to present your Pilgrim Passport to be able to stay in the albergue. And these albergues are very reasonably priced. Some are as low as €5 a night. Others might get up to 15. But the average price that I found when I was in Spain was about €10 a night. So you present your credential as a pilgrim, and in Spanish, it's peregrino is the Spanish word for pilgrim. And so you present your credential, and the first thing every albergue restaurants, places along the way, they all had their stamp. And so they're going to stamp that your passport, and then you would pay your euros and then go select a room. But you're going to find that passport will be one of your cherished possessions, because I pick up my passports all the time and I can look at the stamps and I can think about what I walked by on that day, maybe different people I met, what it was like that day, what I felt. And so it's just sort of a way of just sort of seeing the progress you made to get across Spain to Santiago. The other thing is that what you'll find is most albergues, either on site or at a restaurant or bar very close by, there will be a pilgrim meal available, and those usually cost about 10 euros. In France, the food is more expensive, but the food is really amazing in France. In Spain, they're not. It's not as good as France, but they're more than adequate. So you'll have your meal. There's plenty of. If you drink wine, there's unlimited bottles of wine. I don't drink at all, so I just had water. But there's plenty of wine and bread and everything else that you want, and you're just eating with other pilgrims that day. And then just as you walk across Spain, water is never an issue. Every town has potable water. They'll have fountains, so you can just keep filling your water bottle up as you walk along. If in a typical day, you might go through 3 or 4 towns, so you'll have plenty of opportunities to fill up your water bottle. If there's a situation where the towns are spread out further, there will be a water fountain somewhere along the route. So water's never an issue. You don't need to carry a water filter. Just have a liter bottle to keep filling up as it gets empty. Then during the day, there's plenty of places to eat. That all along the Camino, there are bars and restaurants, and they all have sandwiches or omelets. So, and in fact, as you're walking, you can sometimes see 2 towns ahead of you up on different hills. So you can think in terms of where you're going to have early, maybe late breakfast, early lunch, late lunch, or an afternoon snack. So you can sort of plan your eating as you go along. And so like in this particular bar, there were tables set outside. You can see there's people riding bikes, other people walking. And then this happened to be earlier in the day. So they had breakfast sandwiches and omelets. If you look at the lower rack, you can see you can pick up things like candy bars. So when you're doing the Camino in Spain, let's say if the albergue costs 10 euros, and I don't know what COVID's going to do to prices. And, and certainly there may have been some inflation, but let's say if you spend 10 euros for an albergue, 10 euros for a pilgrim dinner, and then getting a couple sandwiches during the day or candy bars or whatever, you could probably get along for 30 or 35 euros a day when you're walking across Spain. So in addition to this wonderful walking, it's a very affordable way to go to Europe. And then one of the things that you'll find in Spain is that if the towns get spread apart, there will be some enterprising soul out there who will, set up a concession stand so you can stop in and get a Coca-Cola and a snack. So you never have in Spain, you never have to worry about water. You never have to worry about where you're going to eat. And another thing that you'll find on the Camino is a scallop shell is a symbol of the Camino and the symbol of a peregrino on the Camino. So this is my scallop shell tied right onto my backpack, and you're going to see the shell symbol all the entire way. That on walls you'll see shells. In this case, this is a stylized shell right on the road. You're also going to see yellow markers, and both the shell and the yellow marker are pointing to Santiago. So there's so many markings. You're just never going to get lost. All you have to do is keep an eye out for shells or keep an eye out for the markings. You can just an example. Here's a marking on the Camino. In the town of Logroño, if you look at the light post, you can see there's a yellow arrow there. And one of the things that you'll find as you walk through towns, everybody's going to be saying to you, Buen Camino, because that's the greeting that everybody gives to a peregrino as they're walking across Spain. And again, here's another shell embedded in the sidewalk. More arrows. And this one is kind of the trifecta. You've got a boot, a scallop shell, and an arrow, all pointing the way to Santiago. And then another thing that you'll see, if you look here along with the arrow and the shells, there's actually a drawing or a picture of Santiago. So you'll see plenty of symbols of Santiago himself as you make your journey. Now, returning to walking from Roncesvalles, you're still in the Pyrenees, and these horses that you see in the Pyrenees, they're just incredible. They have heavy coats on them. Their hoofs are massive. So, I've never seen horses like that in our country, but in the Pyrenees, you just see these massive horses. And then a couple of days after Roncesvalles, you're going to get into the town of Pamplona. And as you see, here's another town right from the Middle Ages, the narrow streets, the tall structures right on the street. And this is the town where they do the running of the bulls, made famous by Ernest Hemingway. And if you walk out to the bullfighting ring, you're going to find a statue of Ernest Hemingway. And right next to this statue, I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, so I couldn't pass up having a picture of Better Call Saul. And when I was walking, I tell people I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the first thing people say, "Oh, I want to go there to for Breaking Bad and Walter White." So it's amazing, how many people all over the world recognize the whole Breaking Bad universe. And then, after you leave Pamplona, if you've seen a movie on the Camino, you've seen this statue. It's on a tall hill just to the west of Pamplona. And, and these, if you notice, you'll see plenty of, wind turbines in Spain. And then, so you have the wind turbines and the Camino statue as you cross this hill. And when I went, this is early April, and at that time, the canola was in full bloom, and these valleys would just be full of the yellow canola flowers, and it was just gorgeous, up and around these valleys, just packed with canola. You're also, at this time, when you start the Camino, you're in the province of Navarre, and that's a Basque province. So everybody there is Basque, and highlight is the game of the Basque. And so when you go through a town, you'll see these frontons. And I happened to be there. It was a Saturday morning, so I just sat down and watched them play highlight for half an hour and continuing on. And then, I had planned, this is west of Pamplona. This is the town of Vienna. And I had planned on spending the night here, but it was 1:30 in the afternoon, and I wasn't ready to stop walking. And so this is something to consider if you're planning on doing a Camino, to think about, is that every guidebook, regardless of the language, seems to have pretty much the same itinerary. There's a tendency to want to set up a 33-day itinerary to go from St. Jean to Santiago. And that means, and they all pretty much have the same endpoints for the day. And so what can happen is, because a lot of people will follow their guidebook to the letter, some of these endpoints in the albergues can get very crowded. But there's intermediate towns, and those intermediate towns also have albergues. And because I wasn't ready to stop at 1:30, I kept going, and I went to the next town of Manero. But before I got there, I did cross the bridge at Puente Reina. That Puente Reina stands for Queen's Bridge. And I got to Manero, and it was very quiet. And I stayed at this albergue, and there were just 4 people there. And the proprietor, he prepared a dinner for us. And it was just so cool. And this part of the Camino experience is meeting people from different countries. There was this young woman from Estonia, and she spoke flawless English. And I asked her, well, how come your English is so good? And she was telling me that it's very common for young women from Estonia to go to Australia for a couple of years to be au pairs. And so they learn English. And one of the things that you're going to find is, as I mentioned before, I met people from 35 countries. And when you have people from that many countries, that many languages, more often than not, English is going to become the default language. And most of your interactions are going to be with other pilgrims. So, it would be great if you're fluent in Spanish, but it's not a requirement for doing the Camino, because most of the people that you'll be meeting will be able to speak English. And in fact, because you can sit at a table from people from 6 different countries or more, and they're all speaking English. And, I met somebody, this young woman from the Netherlands, and she had flawless English. And I asked her about that. And she said, well, she learned English from watching Friends on television. So it's just one of these things that you just run into, as you're doing something like the Camino. So leaving Manero, this is just stepping right out of Manero, and you can see how close the next town is. And you can also see, the canola and, the vineyards. And this is still early April, so there's no vines on the grapevine. But in this town, you go, and when you get to that town, as you leave it, you're walking on a Roman road. And it's, for a couple miles, this is an old Roman road built 2,000 years ago, and you're walking on it. And it's just such an incredible thing to think about. But it also shows that this has been a travel corridor used by people for thousands of years. And so the walking on it is very reasonable, that you cross plenty of mountains, but the tendency of the Camino is to find the best way to get around the mountains, or the best passes to take. So you rarely have, I'm not saying it's a cakewalk, but you rarely have strenuous walks with very steep routes, because this, as I say, it's a travel corridor that's been set out for thousands of years now. And because you're still in Basque Country, you're going to run across graffiti, saying that they want to be their own country. And some of the graffiti might be a little bit more, have stronger expletives in them. But the thing that I found interesting is that rather than writing the graffiti in their own language or writing it in Spanish, they wrote it in English, to make sure that most of the pilgrims would understand their feelings. And just, again, you just keep walking through this gorgeous scenery. And in this church, the Camino goes right by this church in Vienna, which is a town west of Pamplona. And what's interesting about this church is that it was built by Cesare Borgia. And so if you're familiar with the Borgia family in Florence, well, when Cesare Borgia was kicked out of Florence, he moved to the Iberian Peninsula and he funded this particular church, in Vienna. And then, continuing, you do leave, the Basque Country, and now you're in Rioja, which is Spain's wine country. But you can see it's still early. The vines haven't started growing yet. But again, you can just see what it's like to just keep walking through the scenery. And one of the things that I really got a kick out of, when you reach the town of Logroño, you start seeing storks. And when I was there, the storks built nests on any tall structure or tower. You're going to see storks. So you can see on this church tower, there's 5 stork nests on there. And I want to back up on the storks, but when I was there, the chicks, the baby stork, had just hatched, and they have voracious appetites. So the mother storks have to go out and constantly get food. And when they get back to their nest, the babies, you can just hear them clacking their beaks because they're just so anxious to get something to eat. So it was just such a cool thing to see these storks in there. I had never seen storks before until I got to the Camino. And for me, I love animals, so that was a big part of my Camino experience, with just having animals all along the way, such as these sheep. In this case, that little lamb that you saw, the farmer behind you can see his pant legs there. He had told us that little lamb had been born earlier that day, and so he was still struggling to get up to his mother, and it was just so cool to have that. And then, I noticed this cow. If you notice the cow's udder, it is so bloated with milk that I hope somebody milks that cow very soon, because, she's going to be in a world of pain, because I don't know, you put any more milk in there, this is going to start popping. And then I did run across the quick brown fox that jumped over the road, jumped right in front of me in the Camino. Before I could get my camera out, that fox had jumped into that hole there. So I don't have a picture of the fox, but at least I can tell you I saw a fox while I was going there. And again, this is another place on the Camino. You can see it's sort of, when I approached this area, that German Shepherd was just laying on the ground, just sleeping. And then all of a sudden, the farmer and the cows and the horse following the farmer, they just popped up on the Camino, and the German Shepherd immediately popped up, and we were like a big parade walking up the Camino. The cows, the dog, the farmer, the horse, me, and other peregrinos were just all walking together in this great big mass of people. And then what's interesting about this is there was one guy that we met who had started in Eastern Europe. He had went with a mule and his dog. He had already been to Santiago, and now he was walking home. And when I ran into him, he had stopped in a local bar to get a bottle of beer, and his mule and his dog were just patiently waiting for him. And so in addition to animals, you're going to see just amazing artwork as you go along, that, these sort of murals along the way of this, young woman just sleeping in the flowers. And you can see the arrow there. Or this guy, instead of showing his passport, he presented his chest to you know, to get his stamps, or these silhouettes, or these pilgrims from another era. So this artwork is great. You're also going to see all along the way, you'll see the symbols of the shell, you'll see crosses and other symbols of the Camino. And you just see, like, and again, you've got another stork nest, and then that stylized cross above the church, or in a farm field, or in a little town square, or in the middle of the fog in the mountains. Or in this case, you've got pilgrims taking pictures of a statue of a pilgrim. So I guess you could say, I'm taking a picture of pilgrims taking a picture of the statue. So you have all of this symbolism as you're walking along. And then in this case, you do have folk art. Here's a very much stylized pilgrim pointing the way to Santiago. Or this guy here, he's getting ready to join you. And I love this one because you've got flowers, you've got the shell, and there in the upper right-hand corner, you've got a little pilgrim model. So, and it's almost like everybody goes out of their way to decorate their houses, to make them special, and you're just walking by it every day. So you're just getting this wonderful imagery as you move along. And then there's flowers everywhere. At least when I was there in the April, the flowers were everywhere. And one of the things that I liked is, along the Camino there'd be a little drainage ditch, and if you look closely in there, it's full of tadpoles. Well, later on in my walk, there were tons of frogs. So the frog, when I got late, so maybe in a month or so, all of these little tadpoles will become frogs. And so you have that as and this is something to think about, is that when you're walking day after day after day, it's the little things that keep you going. And so just allowing yourself to be present right here, right now, not doing hardcore, power hiking, not trying to race with anybody, but just allowing yourself to be here and just start observing all the little things. And that's what makes every day special. And one of the things that I really enjoyed, and I saw this over and over again, on one side of the Camino, there'd be a pile of caterpillars, maybe 6 or 7 inches across, just this pile of caterpillars slowly unraveling, going nose to tail, working their way across the Camino. And, obviously I couldn't sit there all day long to see what they were going to do, but I speculate that maybe they make another pile on the other side, and then tomorrow maybe they work their way back to where they were the day before. But again, it's just noticing, allowing yourself to notice all that's in our world. And when you do that, you just realize how lucky we are to be part of it. And so getting back to walking the Camino, the scenery continues to be fantastic. And you do reach the town of Burgos. And Burgos has this huge cathedral. And it's so big, you just can't get a picture of it all. You can get little bits of it. If you look at these guys, they're looking at the top of the cathedral. If you turned around, you might have to take 4 or 5 pictures just to get the entire cathedral in. So you do leave Burgos, and then you reach this area called the Meseta. And that's just this plain, it's much like a lot of not in Galena, but in, going across the flatter parts of Illinois, where there's just unending farm fields, and they happen to grow wheat in this area, and these fields just go on for miles. And what's interesting here is that when you started the Camino, the towns were on the top of the hill, so you could see them from many miles out. Here, the towns are in the drainages, so they're below the the horizon. So you can walk for miles and went, geez, I thought there's a town coming up. And then all of a sudden, you're 100 yards out, and that's when you can finally see the town. And that building we're looking at, that's in Albergue. So there's always a place for you to stay, no matter where you are in Spain. And then you get to Leon, and there they too have a cathedral with a fantastic glass, and you have the windows there. And then just moving along, I got a kick out of this. I was going through the town of Astorga, and I'm right on so you go right through this town, and here's the Queen of Hearts, and the rabbit, and the Queen of Hearts guards. I didn't see Alice in Wonderland, so she must have been around somewhere, but you just keep running into whimsical things to make your day a little bit special. And one of the things I found special was going along, walking on the Camino, and having a town that you come in on a footpath to enter the town, and then when you exit the town, you leave the town on a footpath. And so that was special, that you're not being overrun by cars. You just have, the Camino is in all different shapes, but in some places, it's just a footpath that you're walking on. And then you can see there's more wine country. This is a little bit later on in the Camino. And the vines are coming out on the grapes. So, and if you came a month later, they'd be spread out even further. So you do have, you can start seeing the change of the seasons as you're walking along. And again, you've got the flowers. And so when you finally cross the last mountain range in Spain, you get into Galicia. Galicia is a province in far northwest Spain, and it's just emerald green. I've never been to Ireland, but everybody told me this is what Ireland looks like. And the reason why it's so green is that mountain range is the first mountain range that intercepts storms coming from North America going across the Atlantic. And so this is where all the rain dumps. So it's not like it's raining hard, but it's definitely moist. So you definitely will be wearing your rain gear through much of your walk in Galicia. And this is what it's like walking through Galicia on the Camino. You'll see plenty of these structures. They're called Herreras, and they're for grain storage, and they're set on pedestals to protect the grain from rodents. So again, you see, I guess those are pretty much obsolete, that they've been replaced with more modern, but there's still plenty of them standing as you're walking through Galicia. And then you do get to the town of Soria, and the nature of the Camino changes immediately, because this is where people who are doing the last 100 kilometers to get to Compostela, this is where they come on board. So whereas before, you were always inside of other pilgrims, maybe walking with a couple of others, but here all of a sudden it just becomes really packed, and it's a different atmosphere, because where people doing the longer walk are more or less in for the long haul, and when you do a long distance walk, it becomes a lifestyle as opposed to a vacation. It is your life rather than an interruption. But if you're only doing a shorter walk, the tendency is to treat it as a vacation, there's more of a partying crowd, a louder crowd. But fortunately, by the time you get to Soria, your walking has gotten stronger, so you can pretty much distance yourself from the crowds of people and do things staying in intermediate towns and what have you. But that's just something you have to recognize, that things do, the whole atmosphere does change a bit. And then you do get to Santiago, and you can see the cathedral out there in town. So you walk through the city of Santiago, you do get to the cathedral, and in the cathedral office is actually, I'm standing in front of the cathedral office right here. So that's where you get your Compostela. And at the cathedral, they have a pilgrim's mass every day at noon. So, that's just, so all the pilgrims will go in there, and then you get in there. And, at this point, I was walking with a man from the Netherlands, and he told me, look around, because this is the only time you'll see this many people in a church in Europe. But if you saw the way or saw some movies, what's really amazing is if you look in the center of the picture, you see that silver thing. Well, that is called a botafumeiro, and it's full of incense that has been, they lit the incense. Below the botafumeiro, just below to the left, you'll see a group of monks or priests, and they're pulling on the ropes, and that will get the botafumeiro to start swinging. And so it starts swinging back and forth until it finally gets to the point where it's swinging over your head almost to the ceiling, and then it comes back and swings the other way. And it is so cool having this thing swinging back and forth. And so that is just an incredible experience. And what I would suggest to somebody, if you only have time to do a short period of time on the Camino, I would suggest going to a place like Pamplona, walk west for a week or two, or whatever time you have, and then take a bus into Santiago to get the botafumeiro experience, because your Pilgrim Passport with all the stamps on it is a much more meaningful document to you than getting the Compostela, because the meaning comes from being able to walk with other people, seeing all the scenery, and then obviously having this botafumeiro experience. So with that, I hope with our Camino is done, and I hope I've shown you just how wonderful it is to do a Camino. And again, if you are serious about doing the Camino, I've put together this Word document. There's no charge for it, and I'll be happy to email it to you.